Hello, in this video tutorial we are going to be looking at the content in Unit 2, Activity 3, and specifically this activity is going to focus on something called literary lenses. And so we'll start with a quotation, and the quotation reads, "Most misunderstandings in the world could be avoided if people would take the time to ask what else could this mean." So the purpose of this activity is going to be looking at things from a different perspective. And the idea is that we don't have to look at stories, movies, songs, whatever it is that we're listening to, watching, or reading. We don't have to interpret them in one way. There's multiple different perspectives that we can view or use to analyze whatever it is that we're listening, reading, or watching. And specifically, we're going to look at 4 what we call literary lenses. So 4 different perspectives or theories that we can use when we want to analyze something. And specifically, since this is an English course, we're going to be analyzing stories. And so the 4 lenses we're going to use are the reading response lens, the historical biographical lens, the psychological lens, and the gender lens. There are other lenses that you could look into as well too, but these are the 4 basic ones that we're going to look at in this unit. So to start with, the reading response lens. And the reading response lens essentially is dependent upon the reader. So in this case, you, when you're reading something, you're going to use your own thoughts and your own feelings and your own experiences to interpret whatever it is that you're reading. And so the reading response lens, I think, is probably the simplest to understand. It's just up to the reader to interpret through his or her own perspective. Some of the questions that you can ask when you're looking at something through the reader response lens is, how do you feel about whatever it is that you're reading? Or what does this make you think about? Or how does this relate to your life? So everything goes back to you as the reader and how you are interpreting what you're reading. There is a video here you can take a look at for further explanation. And there's a couple of questions that you can answer here. They're not for an assignment or anything like that, but just to kind of summarize your understanding and make sure that you understand what the reading response lens is. If we move on to the second lens, we've got the historical biographical lens. And this might be, in some cases, the most challenging lens because sometimes this requires research and it requires you to look into the history of the story that you're reading. When was it written? Where was it written? Or look into the history or the biography of the author of the story. Essentially, the historical biographical lens says the more you know about a story, its background, where it was written, when it was written, why it was written, and who wrote it, the more you know about the author, the more you'll understand what you're reading. And so some of you probably have experienced this before in an English class, and you'll experience it again in Unit 3 when we get to our novel. Before you read a novel in an English class, usually the teacher gives you the background of the author, a biography of the author, and an explanation of the history behind the writing of the story. And that's not just to fill time. That's important. The more you know about the history and the more you know about the author, the better you'll understand the story. So a couple of questions that you can consider when looking at a story from the historical biographical lens is to what extent is the writing style of the text typical for the time period? So for example, if you read something from Shakespeare's time, it's certainly going to look and sound a lot different than if you read something that was written in 2021. So again, time period dictates writing style. Other questions you can consider is how do the language, characters, and events reflect when and where the author was writing? Or what are significant events in the author's life that are important to the text? So you'll notice that we're asking questions about the author and about the time period in which the story was written. If you'd like a little more detail, here's a video on the historical biographical lens. And again, each lens is going to end, each note or section here on one of the lenses is going to end with the same two questions, asking you to kind of summarize your understanding. So make sure that you answer the two questions. Our third lens is the psychological lens, and this lens tries to look at stories through psychology or through psychoanalyzing a story. So what we're looking at is we're looking at the motivations, the personalities, the feelings, the desires, the behavior of the characters, and we're trying to analyze a story that way. Most of you have probably heard of Sigmund Freud, who's considered the father of psychoanalysts. His work is still to this day used a lot when we apply the psychological lens to stories. Some of the questions that you can consider when you use the psychological analysis is what forces are motivating the characters? So why are the characters doing what they're doing in the story? Why are they behaving the way that they're behaving? Things like what do the characters' emotions reveal about their psychological states? Or what choices did the characters make, and were the choices moral or ethical? These are all questions that we can get into when we're trying to look at the story through a psychological lens. Again, as always, there's going to be a video for further explanation and 2 summarizing questions. And our fourth and final lens is called the gender lens. So the gender lens views a text or views a story as a commentary on how people from across the gender spectrum are portrayed in society. So what we're doing is we're looking at gender representation in the story, gender roles, power dynamics. So in the story, does one gender tend to hold all of the power? And in the story that you're reading, do you notice very specific gender roles where the men and women do have specific roles and perform specific tasks in the story? Some of the questions that you can ask yourself if you're trying to analyze a story from a gender perspective is, what are the attitudes towards gender roles and identities in the story? Or something like, what gender stereotypes do you notice in the story? Do you notice that the women are being portrayed in a very stereotypical way, for instance? Again, the gender lens often, depending on the time period of the story, can the portrayal of the different genders in the story can be very different. There's a video here with a little more detail on gender theory and gender analysis, and our final 2 questions, as always. I'll give you a very basic example of using the literary lenses, and what we'll do is we won't even look at a story to start with. We'll look at an apple, so an object. And if you were looking at an apple, what would the reader response lens ask? What questions would they ask about the apple? What would the historical biographical lens ask about the apple? The psychological lens and the gender lens. What questions would they ask about an apple? I know an apple is kind of a silly object here to choose, but it's just hopefully a very simplistic way of applying the gender lenses for the first time as an example. What we'll do is we'll take a step up in the consolidation section, and we'll apply the literary lenses to a story. And in this case, we're going to apply it to Cinderella. Not the Disney version of Cinderella, but if you click here, you'll be able to open up a version of Cinderella that was written by the Brothers Grimm. If it'll actually open for me here. There we go. And so it's a pretty short version. It's about 4 pages or so here. And so I'd like you to read through in what many people would consider the original sort of Cinderella fairy tale story. Again, it will not be the same. It'll be a little bit more violent and a little bit more graphic, maybe, than the typical Disney versions of Cinderella. But I'd like you to look at this version of Cinderella and then consider questions that relate to each of the 4 literary lenses. So here are the reading response questions, the historical biographical questions, the psychological questions, and the gender questions. So hopefully this is just encouraging you and kind of forcing you to apply each of the lenses to one story to see how each one kind of analyzes a story differently and comes up with a different interpretation of the story. After you've looked at the 4 lenses in Cinderella on your own, you can take a look at sample answers. So you've got a sample of a reader response analysis of Cinderella, a sample of a historical biographical analysis, a psychological analysis, and a feminist or a gender analysis here. So these are just samples. What you come up with doesn't have to be the same as these samples. They're just giving you an idea of how each of these 4 could have been applied to the story. And that's it. That's your content. Once you've reached this point, you can move on to the assignment.